This is Chapter 4, The Physical Structure of an Economy. We've spent the first 3 chapters looking at fish, bears, trees, grass, bison, hurricanes, and bees that think they're getting it on when really, dude, it's just a flower. And the obvious question is, what this has to do with economics. More concretely, we've traced the paths of energy and matter, building up a model of the physical flows in an economy, and provided a possible explanation for why such structures exist. In this chapter, we'll finally get to the economy itself, extending our ecosystem model to help us understand the economy's physical structure. We'll classify the different types of economic output into primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. We'll define final use and its 2 basic components, consumption and investment. We'll look at nature's role in the economy, and finally consider the evolution and coevolution of technology. So what is the physical economy? We can portray the economy in a schematic form, showing the flows of energy and matter from solar or geological sources. The white arrows represent energy, while the black arrows show matter. We start at the left with our energy sources, the sun, geothermal energy, and radioactive materials. These fundamental building blocks are behind the economy's supplies of raw materials, from ecosystems and agriculture to minerals, fossil fuels, and deposits of radioactive ores. Proceeding to the right, there's the stage of exploitation, which could also be called extraction, in which raw materials are gathered to be made available to the economy. This includes farming, logging, mining, and the capture of water for hydroelectric power. Once the raw materials are obtained, they get processed, fuel burned for power, feedstocks sent to chemical plants, trees turned into lumber, animals slaughtered. From processing, things go to manufacturing, where they are turned into finished products. The end point is consumption, broadly construed. We'll have a narrower, more common definition of it later in the chapter. The food we eat, the houses we live in, the built environment around us, our cars, our appliances. I call this the Charlie diagram because it was drawn at the request of Charlie Hall, recently retired from SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Back to the picture. When it's all done, there's some waste matter left over. Also note that at every step along the way, there are white arrows leading upward. Every step of the economic process involves some application of energy, and the second law of thermodynamics tells us that, one way or another, all of that ends up leaving the system as waste heat. We can also show the economy in a slightly different format. Start by revisiting the stylized diagram of an ecosystem with matter circulating and energy passing through, driving the system. We can modify that by including flows of waste. Then we have our sources of non-renewable resources and ecosystems supplying renewables. The extractive part of the economy goes and gets both types of resources and pulls them into the economy. It passes them to the processing part of the economy, which upgrades them, and then passes them along to manufacturers, which turn them into finished goods. This step also includes the service sector, which uses manufactured goods not to make things, but to do things people want, as when medical staff use an X-ray machine to provide the service of medical care. At the end are the final uses, consumption and investment, which will be discussed more later in the chapter. There's some circulation of matter, as when you put your paper and glass in the recycling bin and it gets turned into new paper and new glass. And some gets decomposed, such as composted organic matter that gets spread on fields, and the waste, in one way or another, ends up back in the ecosystem. But unlike in an ecosystem, there's also waste. This is stuff left over where either we don't know how to reuse or neutralize it, or don't think those things are worth doing, and that also ends up in the ecosystem. As we did with the ecosystem diagram, we can simplify this one by taking off the descriptions of the functions, and then note that matter circulates, though in this case we have to say somewhat rather than mostly, and energy passes through and drives the system, obeying the first and second laws of thermodynamics. So that's the big picture of the economy's physical structure. At a smaller scale, a common way of looking at different types of economic activities is to group them into three sectors: primary, secondary, and tertiary. We can return to the Charlie diagram to map these conventional terms onto the underlying physical processes. The primary sector is resource extraction: agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, hydroelectric installations, wind power. The secondary sector is both processing and manufacturing, so it would range from metallurgy and oil refining, where the inputs are resources in their raw state, to auto manufacturing, where the inputs are resources that have already been processed, such as steel, or even other manufactured goods, such as the car's electronic components. The tertiary sector is services, which covers a vast range of activities, such as medical care, education, wholesale and retail businesses, art, engineering, legal counsel, bookkeeping, restaurants, amusement parks. I've cheated a bit in putting the tertiary sector on the Charlie diagram at all, because that picture is so focused on the economy's physical flows that it doesn't really show the services at all, but they're there and they're important. I mentioned final use earlier, and now it's time to go into that, but we'll get there by way of the difference between consumption and investment and the idea of physical capital. Physical capital is tools used to make stuff. Examples include an oven at a bakery or an assembly line in a car factory. Capital is useful in making goods, but it doesn't end up in the goods, nor is it used up in the process. For a bakery, flour is an input that ends up in the bread. Fuel for the ovens is another input, and the amount needed for a batch of bread is gone once the bread is done. The oven is a piece of capital because it's crucial for producing the bread, but when you're done baking, the oven is still there. Investment is the activity of building physical capital, so that would include building and installing an oven at a bakery or an assembly line at a car factory. It's also the expenditure of money on those activities. Usually in macroeconomics, when we talk about investment, we don't mean the purchase of bonds or stock shares. Those would be called financial investment, but they're also a form of saving, and we'll touch on them in the context of money and assets. We can think about investment and consumption in terms of their relationship to time. Generalizing, investment is about future production. I build a factory this year and start making stuff next year. In contrast, consumption is about now. It covers pretty much all the spending activity of households, things like food and clothes, housing and utilities, appliances, cell phones and cell phone service, medical care, car payments, gasoline, bus fare, vacations, and much more. Together, consumption and investment are the basic types of final use. What's final about final use is that there's no plan for something to be sold again or turned into something else and sold. At a bakery, the flour, water, and gas aren't final use because they're used up in the making of something that's going to be sold. The oven is also being used to make bread to be sold, but it's not being used up, so it is final use. In contrast, when you break bread at home, the flour, water, and gas are used up just like at the bakery, but you're not making something to sell. Your purchase of the inputs was the last time money would change hands, so when you bought those inputs for home baking, they counted as another form of final use. I said that consumption and investment are the basic types of final use, and that's true from a global perspective. But when we're talking about a single country's economy, we also have to account for international trade. And within a country, we distinguish between government spending and other types. Consumption is generally by households, though some of what government pays for is also in the nature of consumption, as with public school teachers providing education, police and military providing security, or social workers providing social services. Investment is often by private firms, building factories, buying computers, and the like. But again, some government activities are also investments, such as putting up school buildings, fixing roads, building dams, constructing aircraft carriers. We haven't talked about the foreign sector, but it's also part of the story. It could be foreign economies buying some of our consumption goods, as when a French movie distribution company buys the rights to show an American film. It could be foreign economies buying our investment goods, if a Chinese company buys American equipment for a factory in China. Examples like those are exports, and they make up part of the final use of things produced by the American economy. And of course, we get some of our goods from other countries. We satisfy some of our demand for final use through the output of other economies, that is, by importing. We'll spend more time on these distinctions in Part 2, when we look at the national income and product accounts.